Heb je ook zo'n
Da... Questo è sempre di capisco abbastanza. Sì, Amsterdam poi in particolare. Sì, ed è uno dei pochi posti in cui è difficile imparare l'olandese per questo motivo qua. Cioè, devi non prendersi troppo sul serio, devi sempre metterti un po' nella posizione di quello, un po' gufo di no, perché appena capiscono che non sei olandese ti rispondono in inglese, invece se gliela butti là un po' in caciara ti correggono perché vogliono essere sempre quelli che hanno ragione. Infatti sì. Ma ti posso lasciare un volantino del video? Sì, se ti interessa, abbiamo un programma sia a Rotterdam che ad Amsterdam. Io sono riuscita in Amsterdam. Io sono della serie non volevi lavorare, questo è il commento.
Mi occupo di un filosofo.
Ok. A fine maggio, praticamente questo è il mio progetto e Regenerative Feedback è un evento che ha avuto luogo l'anno scorso a New York. Questa ragazza mi aveva contattato perché voleva organizzare un evento ed era interessata al mio formato e quindi abbiamo iniziato questa collaborazione. Lei poi è tornata in Olanda e quindi replicherà questo evento che sarà una serie di panel alla fine 24, 25 e 26 maggio al Worm di Rotterdam.
Questo è interessante. Ma quindi esattamente cos'è questo video? Devono leggere
Testi, però per me il testo nel momento in cui ho iniziato, perché io il Noiser l'ho iniziato insieme ad un ragazzo di Manchester solo che poi lui era impegnato con altri progetti, quindi sono rimasta solo io e l'abbiamo pensato il testo come non solo la parola scritta, però dato che comunque si parla di rumore, ci siamo sempre venuti a leggere teorie di rumore, suono, eccetera. Nella maggior parte dei casi succede che delle persone magari non siano alfabetizzate a livello musicale o artistico e quindi hanno bisogno, cioè c'è bisogno comunque dell'input sonoro, dell'input visivo, magari ti guardi un video, quindi non è solo quello, il testo può condurre ad altre esplorazioni, cioè ad altri tipi di lettura. E abbiamo fatto una sessione in cui abbiamo solo guardato questo. Io ho fatto una prima selezione di interessanti.
sto andando in direzione dell'analisi. Adesso non è scritto.
Paola Crespi. Qua c'è, vabbè, questo la mia email personale, però anche qua c'è un'email.
Perché io porto avanti pensando adesso chiaramente non sovrapporre
Sì.
sta facendo. Se riesco ad andare al 29, lei ce l'ha il 29, non so se riesco ad andare.
Sì.
Ho detto sono importanti, sono d'accordo.
Sì.
Vengo qua col coach, vengo col bus del tour per andare a Manchester. Adesso posso venire qua, è fantastico, solo 40 euro per venire.
Veramente?
Come si perde?
Vabbè, ovvio. Ma io dormo ovunque, cioè se mi metti... Per fortuna che mi muovo in bici, perché no.
No, non mi interessa perché parlo con lei, poi quando lei adesso lei è una delle team statali in Italia, però lei però più avanti devo vedere di iniziare qualcosa,
Io sono board member, cioè è successo in maniera totalmente casuale, del comitato di ricerca di social cibernetica all'Associazione Internazionale di Sociologia, perché l'anno scorso ho proposto un paper con questo progetto qua, perché non sapevo nulla di social cibernetica, mio amico mi ha passato questa call in cui loro stavano cercando progetti un po' più artistici e alla fine ho proprio avuto non lo so, ci siamo trovati con tutti questi nerd, alcuni super vecchissimi, adoro, però loro sono molto
no,
aperti
ma interessa, ma a me interessa perché sto andando all'università questa linguistica positivistica, no?
sì.
Che mi stanno facendo, quindi non capisco che però voi adesso ho creato non capivo come faccio a capire questo, però vedi che vado
Sì, è la posizione migliore.
sono ovunque però poi
Esatto, da tutto.
no guarda voglio
Ti scrivo anche la mia personale,
questo mi interessa
qua comunque trovi l'email di Noiser, quindi
perché stavo leggendo una delle io devo fare la vita e stavo leggendo
Should we continue? Okay, our next speaker of today is Pavel Zambovic. He's Slovenian-born and Amsterdam-based artist with particular interest in sound, new media, real-time interaction, and question of contemporary mediation in relation to the sense of bodily presence. In 2017, he completed his artistic research fellowship. I guess it's resulted with PhD defense. Kind of, yes. In Bergen Academy of Arts and Design in Norway, with a project Rhythm of Presence. A focus on invisible manifestation of bodily experience as an acoustic and temporal phenomenon. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Okay, thank you for having me. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be here to address certain issues that I was actually quite busy with during my few years past practice, considering the possibilities of rhythm as a reconfiguring perhaps some questions that were raised very urgently just before me about notions of representation, the other, the rules of representation, and also perhaps the relation between noise and silence and signal and noise in a very say from philosophical to very urgent and political context. So I will talk about one particular work today that's called Rhythms of Presence. It's an artistic work, and in contrast to the previous speaker, I'm focusing on not on an event but on a non-event, basically, and like developing the modes of listening to the non-event as a possibility to philosophically, perhaps based on experience, but then to philosophically kind of try to reconsider the way we operate and are in the world. So my presentation is part of my this so-called PhD, and it will take around 40-45 minutes. I will try to take you through some points that I want to raise. And if you would like to read the whole PhD, it's on my website. You can download it on the PDF form. Okay, so I will start. So I will start my talk with a short description and an outline of a situational impression of the installation Rhythms of Presence, which will be followed by examining 3 key areas of interest that come up in this with this work, and these are very basic things like a body, space, and temporality. So first, a brief description of the work. So Rhythms of Presence is comprised, the installation is comprised of 2 20 square meter floor surfaces. One is discretely installed in an undisclosed location, and what I mean with discretely installed in an undisclosed location is nobody knows it's there. People that are there have no clue that there is something there, and it is undisclosed. So I install it somewhere. I don't tell anyone that this is there and that where it is. So, and the other floor surface is installed in the exhibition space, which is the space of representation, of course. So they are identical in size and shape. The surface at the undisclosed location can sense human steps, transmitting their temporal and spatial information to the exhibition space, where a grid of mechanical knockers invisibly taps out the rhythms of the remotely detected steps and follows their path from below the floor surface. So, just not to explain too much, I will just show you the video documentation of it so you have an idea what I'm talking about. I will just skip this and read it because this is exactly... So this was in the exhibition space, yeah? So, upon entry into the installation, one finds oneself in a situation that is uncanny, disorienting, confusing, unfixed, and unadaptable. In this bright and seemingly empty room, there is nothing to hold on to besides a short text on a piece of paper describing the proceeding taking place in the installation. There seems to be no body of work, no narrative, no structure to anchor the visitor. It is not clear where this work is taking place. It has no beginning and no end, no dramaturgical or compositional structure, and not much physical presence. As such, this work has no single topographical site. There is no center. It exists in several places. It is real and imaginary at the same time. The exhibition space is not the central place of representation where one can grasp the work in its entirety. It rather operates as an evasive and unstable crossing, a place of interference between sites, bodies, presences, and absences that appear and disappear without compositional structure or comprehensible order. Contrary to this topographical dispersion, the work possesses a temporal unity that comes into being through the synchronicity of the shared event of a step that touches, sounds, echoes, resonates, vibrates, and resounds across all the sites simultaneously. This procedure embodies the activity of listening to a fragment of the hidden rhythms of everyday life. The work doesn't aim towards analysis, understanding, interpretation, and representation of these rhythms, or to signify these uncovered rhythms. It is conceived as a place that accommodates these rhythms so they might appear in their unexpected and illegible otherness as sonic, tactile, and spatial figures. This allows for an investigation into the bodily presence, spatiality, and temporality that might produce within the setting of this installation, and how these inform contemporary conditions of networked reality, for example. Now I turn my focus to rhythm as a bodily force and how it manifests and complicates the notion of bodily presence in the given context of this installation. So if we hear these knocks as decontextualized rhythms of everyday steps, the process of capture, transduction, displacement, mediation, and kinetic re-embodiment of the moments and points of contact between the foot and the ground involves extracting the steps from the bodies and the ground that brought them into being. This procedure opens up the space in between the foot and the ground, making the transduced steps appear bodiless and groundless, yet not otherworldly. Invisibly tapping below the floor, they signal anonymous presences in search of the bodies and places they inhabit. Here I examine how through appearing, the rhythms of steps constitute bodily presence and the body as such. What are the forces that might rhythm these bodies into motion, and how? There is more than one answer. The plurality of suggestions opens up possibilities for what these concrete bodies might be, which I explore from three different points of understanding: body as mass, rhythmed body, and body as rhythm, concluding with a comment on rhythms of steps as hidden involuntary somatic utterances of body in motion. I will go quickly through these three notions of body. Some, I guess, you're familiar because it refers to the rhythm analysis and so on, but I'll just mention briefly. So, body as mass. In his essay, Corpus, Jean-Luc Nancy defines body as follows. Bodies are first masses. Masses offered without anything to articulate, without anything to discourse about, without anything to add to them. Discharges of writing rather than surfaces to be covered by writings. Discharges, abandonments, retreats. No written bodies, no writing on the body. For indeed, the body is not a focus of writing. No doubt one writes, but it is absolutely not where one writes, nor is it what one writes. It is always what writing ascribes. In all writing, a body is traced, is the tracing and the trace, is the letter, yet never the letter, a literality, or rather lettericity, that is no longer legible. A body is what cannot be read in writing. End of quote. In the context of the installation at stake, the rhythms that visibly punctuate the floor in the exhibition space might evoke the illegible weighted bodies Nancy writes about. The bodies appear as masses that step through the space somewhere, while sensed through the knocking as bodies that populate and ascribe this place with their own presence in their becoming. Their presences are sensed and felt as they resist identification and inscription with meaning. Rhythmed body. In hearing the illegible rhythms of steps produced by body as mass, I contemplate the forces that might rhythm this body into motion. I use the term to rhythm as a verb in order to emphasize the influence of material and immaterial entities that set the body into particular modalities of movement. For example, a weekly working hour rhythms the body into a certain scheduled movement. The way the city is planned rhythms the bodily movements of its inhabitants. This is not to make these formative forces legible or to identify and name the rhythmed bodies. It is rather to outline the complexity and plurality of these forces and their interferences as they pass through the body, rhythming it into presence. So one of those bodies could be said as a culturalized body, so body as a public space. The rhythm of everyday steps signals movement that seems to be non-performative in its purposeful and somatic activity. Yet there are external immaterial forces shaping the modalities of everyday bodily movements and gestures. These forces are cultural inscriptions on the body that silently perform through its movement. They do not convey direct meaning, but rather radiate a tone, a modality of movement akin to the way a word's utterance contributes to its meaning. These modalities of movement are not enacted or perceived consciously as performative. They are internalized through culturalization. The rhythms of steps might intone some of this hidden culturalization that performs through purposeful, everyday bodily movements. Rhythmed body. In addition to cultural inscriptions that rhythm the body from within, the body is also rhythmed by external forces such as public schedules, urban constellations, political structures, work schedules, social relations, living conditions, and so on, that rhythm the body in motion. The attention towards this rhythming process is opening the way towards understanding the manifestation of bodily presence as an ongoing relational process between various internal and external forces. Body as rhythm. Thinking about the body in terms of rhythm analysis, Lefebvre and Regulier imagine multiple rhythms that coexist in a living body. They write, the living body can and must consider itself as an interaction of organs situated inside it, where each organ has its own rhythm but is subject to a spatial temporal whole. Furthermore, this human body is the site and place of interaction between the biological, the physiological, and the social, where each of these levels, each of these dimensions has its own specificity, therefore its space-time, its rhythm. Whence the inevitable shocks, disruptions, and disturbances in this ensemble, whose stability is absolutely never guaranteed. End of quote. So considering this passage, I propose that the inevitable shocks, disruptions, and disturbances are actually central in establishing a body. This claim proposes that what establishes a body is not only harmonious coexistence between related rhythms, but also and mainly a continuity of frictions and disruptions between incompatibilities of internal and external rhythms that belong to different dimensions and functionalities altogether. As such, these frictions constitute a body as a site of interference and as interference itself. So what is this body as interference? A short passage from a film In Praise of Love by Jean-Luc Godard is useful in bringing the body as interference to the fore, featuring a dialogue between the characters of a film director and a young actress auditioning for the film role. So I would like to show you this now.
Vous allez faire quoi là-dedans? Et vous allez faire quoi là-dedans?
Je pense que je représenterais la jeune fille.
Je pense à quelque chose. Supposons qu'elle s'appelle, lui s'appelle Perceval. Et elle s'appellera Églantine. Très bien. Alors, bon, très bien.
Je suis Églantine.
Très bien. Alors, bon, est-ce que vous faites une différence? Est-ce que vous avez compris que ce n'est pas l'histoire d'Églantine, mais un moment de l'histoire, la grande histoire qui passe à travers Églantine, le moment de la jeunesse?
Oui.
Le moment de la jeunesse.
So this is the dialogue that they were just engaged with. So one could read this dialogue as a poetical unraveling of an intricate interdependency between anonymous flow of history and intimate and lived subjectivity that through their interference establish a body where the external anonymous flow of history that is passing through the body is manifesting and being lived as subjective and intimate life, which it is, but at the same time, this flow remains something that precedes and exceeds human expression. This external flow can exist outside of a body only as a potentiality. There, it is anonymous in plurality of its possibilities, of which only one can flow through a certain body at a certain moment in time, and is by that being realized into actuality. Reciprocally, that body can only become itself as being a host, a channel, a vessel for this particular anonymous flow. In the case of Godard's movie, this is the interference constituting a body in the moment of youth. Body as intra-action. Perhaps this line of thinking might evoke the notion that Karen Barad has termed and defined as intra-action. Here is a condensed explanation about this term. She writes, the usual notion of interaction assumes that there are individual, independently existed entities or agents that pre-exist their acting upon one another. By contrast, the notion of intra-action queers the familiar sense of causality, and more generally unsettles the metaphysics of individualism. Individuals do not pre-exist as such, but rather materialize in intra-action. That is, intra-action goes to the question of the making of differences of individuals rather than assuming their independent or prior existence. Individuals do not exist, but are not individually determinate. Rather, individuals only exist within phenomena, in their ongoing, iteratively interactive reconfiguring. End of quote. So, what she's saying is that the individuals become into being through the interactivity of forces and are not only active or passive agents, but both of them. Their activity, relationality, and passivity makes them as they interfere with the world. Barad outpaces the metaphor of body as vessel and body as flux in understanding the vessel as constituted by flux and the other way around. She asserts, There is no prior existence. The existence is always in making, in contingent becoming. In response to opening the question of how the rhythms of steps, through their appearance, constitute bodily presence, and what that body might be, the tapping rhythms beneath the floor could be said to evoke the presence of remote stepping bodies. And further, that these are formed as ongoing interactions, interferences, resonances, and frictions between their variants of being, continually constituted and reconstituted. These processes set the bodies in motion. Their interactions with the environment and other bodies contribute to forming relational situations. As much as these bodies radiate presence, they can also appear opaque, non-representable, illegible, and evasive in their abstracted invisibility. So these rhythms of steps as hidden involuntary somatic utterances of bodies in motion. Hearing the rhythms of everyday steps as they move across the floor in the installation, one listens to usually hidden temporal qualities of purposeful, non-performative, everyday, infraordinary activity captured, transduced, and rearticulated. This staging might direct the way in which we listen so that we hear them as somatic utterances, generating expectation in terms of what they might convey, while likewise amplifying their opacity. The relation between the initial non-performativity of the rhythms of steps and their staging that suggests the opposite amplifies the inherent tension and further complicates their position and role in relation to bodily self-expression and articulation of self-presence and meaning. Understanding the body itself as a complex plurality of interactions between forces originating from within and externally, the rhythms manifest as interference between two synchronous processes of negotiations, a plurality of interiors and exteriors, one that forms the body and the other situating it in the space. These two processes unfold at various speeds in different material and immaterial dimensions, temporal scales and contexts, forming their own intensities, resonances, frictions, durations, and appearances. They unfurl in parallel and are by no means linear, nor comprise a dialectic. They coincide with or oppose each other, amplify or annihilate one another's doings, encompass or are encompassed by one another as they flow separately or as one flux in continuous process of becoming. In other words, their relation is very messy. Nevertheless, throughout these motions and possibilities, with each step they bounce in synchrony. The moment of touch between the foot and the ground marks a concrete moment of grounding, a point in time when all the acting forces and processes, no matter how diverse or different in dimension, temporality, or origin, touch a margin as they bounce against it, shaking the inside and the outside. Each of these forces is subjected to its own gravitational pull as it bounces off a margin specific to it. These synchronous moments of touch outline and materialize the margins, the boundaries of stepping body as being in between. As we cannot grasp or know entirely the plurality and relational complexity of all the interfering processes and forces as they form a body, subjecthood, and subjectivity, we can sense and perceive the pace of their becomings through the rhythms of steps as sonic figure. As such, one could characterize these utterances as that which sounds but which has no voice, or is sonic but speechless, or to borrow a sentence from Barat, a speaking silence that is neither silence nor speech, but the conditions of impossibility for non-existence. So, impossibility for non-existence. Oh. An utterance that doesn't know itself, an utterance that forgets itself. In their omnipresent and ongoing low intensity, rhythms of steps are so ubiquitous that they operate below the threshold of experience and memory. They are unrememberable. They are enacted, uttered, and endured, yet at the edge of being experienced or lived. They instantly and constantly fall into oblivion like the fading of the sound they make. They tap the rhythms of their unlived self-oblivion, uttering the constant passing of the present. These utterances echoes Giorgio Agamben when he writes, "The present is nothing other than this unlived element in everything that is lived. That which impedes access to the present is precisely the mass of what, for some reason, its traumatic character, its excessive nearness, we have not managed to live. The attention to this unlived is the life of the contemporary, and to be contemporary means in this sense to return to a present where we have never been." End of quote. The rhythms of steps are the unlived element in everything that is lived. Their non-experience and constant amnesia impede access to them as lived, and yet the same non-experience and amnesia enable them to utter the constant passing of the present. These cannot be experienced nor remembered in its transient presentness. The rhythms utter the contradictory duality of non-experience and oblivion of the contemporary. They announce the contemporary as the impossibility to return to a present where we have never been. They utter the contemporary as attention to the impossibility of experience and the continuous oblivion of the passing of the present, to which we cannot return for not having never been there, but because it is not a place. It is not a there. It is something that passes through. Perhaps the constant passing of the present that the rhythms of steps utter precedes and exceeds subjecthood and subjectivity, outside of meaning and experience. It is the other that resides within the self. I would like to move to space now. So in this section, I talk about the workings of the distributed body of the installation and how it creates particular connective disjunctive space, which acts as a site where the phenomenon of passing by remotely occurs. So, hearing the distributed body of the installation between some there and over here. While each knock below the floor in the exhibition space might be perceived as signaling the presence of an anonymous stepping body at an unknown location, it can also be heard as manifesting the presence of another body that is invisibly yet concretely populating both installation sites. This distributed body of the installation consists of floor surfaces, sensors, wires, electronic circuits, computers, network connections, and mechanical knockers. The body that does not so much signal its own presence as it establishes particular connective disjunctive space as a shadow that is some there, over here, and in between at the same time. I use the term locatability to indicate the condition of being geographically located or geographically locating a place or a person. And I claim that this situation is resisting locatability. The distributed body of the installation is engaged in remote sensing and transduction of tactility from one place to another. Simultaneously, it does not reveal the location and the characteristics of the space it senses. Resisting locatability is a rupture that makes it impossible for the transduced rhythms of steps to represent the stepping bodies and their origin, while the transduction of tactility enhances and encourages attention to to the evolving, illegible, anonymous, and contingent actuality. It is not a space of representation, but one that invites listening and attention, indefinitely postponing recognition and identification. I think this is very important here, also in relation to what has been said earlier today, in a different way. So, the next phenomenon or situation I want to talk about is the phenomenon of passing by remotely. So, as the networked space in general, through connectivity, transmits presence and enables contact and communication, it similarly and simultaneously establishes shared zones of absence, passivity, and non-contact, perhaps mediating indifference. Facilitating active communication and intentional transmission of information, it also pushes places and people into mediated proximity that is not intentional on their part. One could say that in the later case, the network space instigates a situation in which one is connected involuntarily and unknowingly, sometimes randomly. One's presence is displaced and put into proximity with another's, passing by each other and occasionally forming involuntary, temporary assemblages. Such a situation is enacted in this installation in which stepping bodies simultaneously traverse two places. The distributed body pushes them into mediated proximity. The space gives rise to a situation in which these bodies remotely pass by each other. An uncanny relation takes place between them, a relation of non-relation. Stepping on the floor, the visitor to the exhibition is touched by the connective disruptive body of the installation. Sensing the presence of the anonymous bodies in the unknown place, the visitor is somehow present and in proximity to the other stepping bodies as an invisible witness. Yet, the visitor can only be present there imperceptibly, not knowing where her or his presence looms anonymous, hidden, and invisible. It is a kind of sharing and doubling of the unawareness between the bodies stepping through two remote places, both unaware of each other in ways that are not reciprocal. The sensed bodies do not know that they are being sensed and influential. The listening bodies do not know where and who they listen to. Nevertheless, they are all pushed into mediated proximity, brushing against each other. If these bodies share anything besides being in remote proximity, it is the condition of their mutual unawareness of each other as they remotely pass by each other. As they engage in the non-event of passing by remotely, they enter into a relation of non-relation. I would like to revisit Agamben's query, what is contemporary now, and reiterate that which impedes access to the present is precisely the mass of what, for some reason, we have not managed to live. The attention to this unlived is the life of the contemporary. And to be contemporary means, in this sense, to return to a present where we have never been. So, in the context of Agamben's argument, passing by remotely might be an opportunity for the relations between the lived and unlived passing of the present, experience, and individuality to be reconsidered in spatial displacement and resituating. This process suggests a possibility for unaware sharing of one's own unlived present with strangers that one has never met and will perhaps never meet. I call this othering self. As the visitor is exposed to the rhythms and parts of the anonymous step, she partly experiences the passing of the present of the remote other that the other cannot manage to live. In so doing, the visitor somewhat lives the unlived present of the other, and through that becomes a remote consciousness for that unlived of the other. not by making sense, knowing, or understanding, but in being experientially exposed to that which is experientially inaccessible to the other who enacts it. This process of othering self makes available the realization that unlived element in everything that is lived might be the familiar and ungraspable otherness that we all share. Pre-personal and existing outside of culture, it is always already there. It appears to be inaccessible through self-awareness, identification, knowledge, and representation. It is accessible to a body that suspends its subjectivity and individuality, its desire for knowing, interpretation, and meaning, too close to see and too far to know, for a body that moves and is moved, that allows being touched, a body ready to dance with the other, recognizing itself as the other. So, 5 minutes. And then Q&A? Okay. I think I can. So the last topic, temporality. So in this final section, I would like to contemplate about procedures of the distributed body of the installation and how it situates work in the terms of temporality. So crossing the passings of the present times. So in the beginning of this text, I note that the installation in the exhibition space does not act as a central place of representation, but rather as crossing and interference between sites, bodies, presences, and absences that are appearing and disappearing without comprehensible order and compositional structure, but that are all sharing a temporal unity that comes into being through the synchronicity of shared event of step that touches, sounds, and resonates through all these sites simultaneously. I later argue that the rhythms of steps utter the passing of the present that eludes being lived due to its continuous and transitory presentness and unrememberability. The installation offers itself as a place in which this passing can be lived through the process of othering self, by being experientially exposed to the unlived rhythms of steps of the unknown other. I would like to further investigate the temporal situatedness of the installation in proposing that through the workings of distributed body of the installation, the setting in this exhibition space is a crossing of the passings of the present times, those of anonymous stepping bodies at the unknown location and those of the visitors in the exhibition space. As they surface in the exhibition space, they are intercepted fragments of unknown and contingent lifelong durations. The temporalities of these fragments are not composed or structured. They are not dramaturgically shaped or composed into narratives encompassing durations other than those of their passings, such as is the case with most music, literature, film, and time-based fine art, as well as images and objects that establish their own temporalities, usually compressing, cutting, and editing the passing of the real time into a narrative of perceptively manageable, complete, repeatable, and reproducible durations. Contrary to the constitution of performative temporalities of representation, the two intercepted temporalities stay with the unstructured passing of the present and in this sense are non-performative. The installation intervenes in the temporality of the exhibition space by foregrounding the non-performative temporality in a location of performative temporality. Okay. So such non-performative temporalities of these passings of the present materialized and signalized by the rhythms of everyday steps embody temporalities of becoming that precede and exceed temporalities of classification, signification, and representation. Becoming the audience through the act of intra-action. So I'm coming back to intra-action. Recalling the notion that the body is both a site and process of becoming, the installation establishes a place of interference between the two contingent processes and temporalities of becoming that interfere with one another prior and posterior to their being established as situated subject, the visitor, and as performative signifying object, the artistic work, respectively. The interference that the installation accommodates is not following the process of their individual becomings configurings. It inserts itself as an integral interactive agency in the process and temporalities of their becoming, recalling Barat's notion of intra-action. Here, individuals do not pre-exist as such, but rather materialize in interaction. That is, individuals only exist within phenomena in their ongoing, iteratively interactive reconfiguring. Staying within this framework, I suggest that specific setting of this installation acts as a constructed cut that undoes preconceived and expected subject-object relation between the visitor and the artwork. This intervention allows for visitors and the distributed body of the installation to engage in the intra-action as mutually formative agencies in their becoming subjective individualities and performative signifiers, materializing each other in their ongoing iteratively interactive reconfiguring, evolving within the temporality of becoming. The agencies of the distributed body of the installation configure the visitor as attentive stepping body that senses, listens, thinks, guesses, imagines, and contemplates. It is a displaced body in passing, an anonymous body that touches and is touched, though not addressed. This continuous interaction pushes the visitor into the state of being the illegible I that exists outside of subjectivity, evoking Nancy's illegible body as mass. Through continuous interaction between the distributed body of the installation and the visitor, the latter's subjectivity is destabilized. It is pushed into the state that is preceding and exceeding subjecthood. There, its rhythms and paths of steps interfere and mix with the remotely transduced rhythms and paths of anonymous steps. The border between presence and absence, between the inner self-presence and external noise of the unknown other is blurred. The inner rhythms of self-presence and external rhythms of the unknown other's presence are both part of the otherness that we all share. At the same time, interaction situates the visitor as the locus for continuously evolving signification, representation, classification, and interpretation of the distributed body of the installation. The visitor configures the distributed body of the installation from a singular and situated point of being, assigning it a singular meaning of plurality of potentialities that it might be. Stemming from a plurality of visitors and by that constructed cuts, this renders the plurality of situated and embodied representations that signify the distributed body of the installation and artwork. The setting does not offer one configuration as accomplished representation to be read, interpreted, translated, and related to. It is suspended in the continuous temporality of becoming that never resolves into a fixed and unified temporality of representation. It rather establishes a place and time for being with and for passing by remotely the ongoing temporality of becoming of the other, recognizing itself as the other.
Thank you so much. Any questions?
I was curious what was happening when you talked about the former speaker.
Right.
You were getting emotional, or was it not? Did I see it well? Because maybe I thought when you said.
Yeah. No, I mean, like for me, like I see some kind of references that touch upon like the problematics of representation and the frame of representation, like in a very urgent and like kind of political and like existential way that Joseph was speaking about, and like he through this kind of like talking about this event addressed this kind of a fake promise of being represented and and through that, at least how I understood, kind of problematize the whole system of so we have a system of representational democracy that kind of dictates who is going to be represented in what way, and that excludes, you know, certain subjects from the debate based on the not saying like it is you cannot participate, saying yes you can participate, but the rules are set in such a way that you can't. Yeah. So and this, I think it is the crisis, this contemporary crisis, that is the most pertinent and visible in the cases like this. But it is actually like, and this is what we have to realize. It is our problem. Everybody. Yeah. And I mean, of course, like I'm talking here in the like, you know, it's an artwork. It's not like politically engaged and so on. But it does kind of the way I see, and then like when did I say that it's important? It does kind of try to address this kind of possibility of kind of relating to the world and to the other, not on the basis of representation and categorization, but rather on the basis of like being with, like, which means like, you know, how like, yeah,
Witnessing.
not witnessing.
No.
Just like imagine if you go and dance with somebody, you know. Then there's.
I think the work already showed that, or made it perceptible in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, but I'm trying to. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, sometimes for me, like the work already says so much, and then when you try or when you analyze it, I wonder whether this whole analyzation of the work is also specifically about your work, or is it not much more? I mean, it could also be the case, for example, that I'm in a room and I'm confronted with an apple, for example.
Right.
It's just a thought that I had, but could it also be possible that all this theoretical analysis can also be valid for my encounter in a space with an apple?
Sure. I mean, like the way I think about this part of my work, which is like kind of analyze our thinking, and you know, it's like it's basically kind of trying to think from the position that this particular situation that was created like as an experiential situation, like how could I think from that point, and this is for me, how could I think from that point and develop certain thoughts that I otherwise wouldn't, you know. So in that sense, and it is not like I don't consider the relation between the text and the work. The work doesn't need the text. You know,
also the other way around. I wonder about that.
Well, this I don't know. This you have to tell me, because.
It might be a bit tough because it's a lot of text, so I might think.
Yeah, this.
But it was just my thought.
I had a question on maybe a little bit out there, but so the body is a site of like political trauma, and so I'm thinking about manifestations of diseases that are related to the trauma one experiences in a political event. And I don't know, like, you know, partially it's not about invisibility, but it is for me in a way because there's no way to really express this in a scientific manner. But I'm thinking of a friend of mine who passed away from cancer at a very young age and was very convinced that the invasion of Iraq had a big role in the development of his cancer because he was plagued with feelings of shame and guilt, and it kept him awake at night. And so, I'm just interested in your thoughts on this idea of political trauma, because you mentioned Lefebvre's notion of physiological, biological, and social, but you didn't mention political.
No, I just briefly, I mean, it's all, of course, all these immaterial forces definitely, like, they pass through, and they don't, I think that they are all very, like, significant, even, like, and perhaps we don't, like within the present system of, like, how the human is kind of compartmentalized into, like, the medical, social, political stuff, and then, like, like you deal with something and you deal with something else, but you don't really kind of make connections. Is also, like, perhaps, like, the disembodiment of the individual to kind of, like, already on that level to take some control and to take away some control. Yeah. So I think, and I think, like, I mean, I was just also, like, very much interested, like, thinking about the bodily presence, like, through this, like, through this kind of very banal thing, and like, what kind of entry point could it be, could that offer to think about, things like that, like flux, like immaterial and material passing through, rather than having, like, a body as one and then thinking where it is engaged, what it is engaged in. So, like, kind of questioning this understanding of the difference between the interiority and exteriority, and also, like, when, like, talking about Barad and her notion of interaction, I think it is very pertinent because it points exactly towards that. We do not exist, as, like, as a given, like that. There is, like, the subjectivity is a two-way process, always. You can never, you are always, like, in becoming who you are in relation to what is, next to you, and or with what you interact, or how you're being framed, and the opposite. So there is no, stable, and I think, like, focusing on this moment actually presents a possibility for a crack to perhaps, like, kind of break this impossibility of, like, being represented by the other, in a sense, on a philosophical level. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So and this is something that, that I think can have, like, political, consequences. Yeah. The kind of destabilizing this, like, okay, the object kind of way of thinking and the stability. Yeah. So, like, okay, this is like this is like that. No, everything is, like, defining one another, and perhaps the questions of, like, like, for example, when Joseph was talking about, why, the inhabitants, like, in the Barmer, like, but, the thing is, but they could have done more, themselves. No, because it is through this act of interaction, it is not possible, So I mean, this is how I see it. I don't know, maybe I'm saying too much, but I don't know. But,
Can I ask you what role plays the archiving of your work? What role does it play? Because suddenly it becomes an object. It becomes something static. It is no more part of the present. It becomes, it's no more a lived experience. And I don't know if you archive it and this is part of the work. Like, what role is it, this archiving?
But what do you mean by archiving?
Because we heard the recording of what has happened at some
Right,
point
yeah.
within those rooms.
Yeah.
So this is a type of archiving somehow, or keeping trace.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean,
keeping what
Mm.
role or what
Yeah.
can it play, or why do you keep trace or not?
yeah. So yeah, that is like so. I would kind of differentiate the two, like here, like two levels of archiving. So first, when it comes to the steps that you are hearing, they're not archived. So they happen in real time. So all the knocks that you hear, like and that you feel, they're like there's like actually some bodies are stepping there, and then there is no storage. There is no storage of that. So that is just comes and goes. Yeah, in real time, and it's not archived in any way. So in that sense, there is no archiving of this kind of collected data. But here, yes, there is.
Okay.
I mean, archiving. It's like, yeah. I mean, now, like, how do you understand archiving in terms of like it's? I would rather say it's documented. Because yeah, it is, and then yeah, I mean, it is documented as a reference for something that happened, but and it is like, I would say, like, if it goes in terms of archive, it is like a low level of archiving, and I didn't really think about it. I will say. You see, I'm kind of rambling around now. I didn't think about it in a sense of that it's part of the work. Like, for example, like the archiving of not archiving, documenting the installation. Also, I mean, it is for me kind of very difficult also to thinking about documentation of something that there is not much to see really.
Yeah, that's why I was asking.
Yes, and this is like this presents like I'm very, in one hand I'm very happy about it. On another hand, there is like there is always the imperative of having something to show. You know, yeah. Having yeah.
I have to interfere because we are running late. Thank you so much for your presentation and for the questions. Let's give a round of applause. We are running late than we expected, so I would make like a super short break of few minutes. Somebody who needs to visit the toilet or something, and really please come back like in a few minutes, yeah? And yeah, I guess, sorry, we are running a little bit late, so please stay with us.
Oh yeah. Thank you. Yeah? Yes. Yeah. I think so, yeah. But we are You can't keep it. I mean, just put it in my backpack. I'll bring it home. And it always goes down.
Oh, great, thanks. Thanks. The second. No, there is no order. It's alphabetical order.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Works? Yeah. Okay, please take a seat. Ah, some water.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
Works? Please take a seat. So our final speaker of today, Helen Pritchard. She's an artist and geographer. I would speculate and say that perhaps friction and tuning are the key terms of everyday practice of Helen. Because of she combines poetic, artistic and rational scientific methods in her transdisciplinary practice. She's working with multiple actors and multiple agencies in her transdisciplinary research project. She's addressing really urgent topics, such as environmental pollution, such as citizen engagement, and that also creates a lot of frictions and hopefully tuning. She's dedicated to feminist and queer studies, do-it-yourself movement, and also she's leading a digital arts computing department at Goldsmiths University. So it's a lot of activities. Thank you so much again. We started yesterday with a small workshop, and welcome, and stage is yours.
Well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the very interesting talks this morning as well. I'm going to talk about some of the frictions in collective monitoring, which are often glossed over when we think about citizen sensing. Often citizen sensing is described as a kind of individual pursuit, that somehow there's a kind of smooth path to collective and political action. And in our work in Citizen Sense, we've been I guess trying to attune to also some of the difficulties and violences that we might need to collectively experience to kind of progress towards political action. And then that's not always a smooth path. So citizen sensing is a practice of monitoring environments. And in many ways, it's structured as this kind of individual pursuit, much through the devices that are promoted for citizen sensing. The very term citizen within citizen sensing suggests that this is a practice of sensing is the terrain of one political subject using a digital device to monitor her or his environment to be order to take individual action. Yet in some circumstances, citizen sensing practices are actually reworking the sites and distributions of environmental monitoring towards other configurations that are much more multiple and collective. And this is something that my colleague and the PI of Citizen Sense, Jennifer Gabrice, has written about extensively. So in the project, we have been interested in thinking about what might the qualities and capacities of these collective modes of sensing be, and how might they shift the assumed parameters and effectiveness of citizen sensing. So how might we think about what the capacities of collective sensing might be? And so Gabrice has discussed citizen sensing might address everything from air pollution to the migration of animals, where sensors generate data on any number of environmental phenomena. So it's a kind of encompasses a wide area of monitoring and measuring environments. And discussions about citizen science and citizen sensing often focus on the technologies, methods and outcomes of monitoring practices. So although these are very important areas of inquiry to think about how those technologies work, we also are kind of committed to thinking about, how, and especially here, how the subjects, including these collective subjects of monitoring, become constituted in order to examine how these environmental problems are felt. And I guess we could also think about that as a type of tuning. And to consider how political action might be constituted as this kind of collective pursuit. So if we think about how entities and environments are formed, we might start to think about how they're formed through the distributions of perception and feeling. And to do this, we've been engaging with the work of Simondon to consider how both the individual and collective potential becomes trans-individuated through our perception and milieu. And so we want to extend this insight to demonstrate how technical relations, or technicity, might take hold and to what extent. And today I'm going to talk about our work in which we've done this through particularly focusing on air pollution and how air pollution itself might be considered as a type of perceptive problematic, to use Simondon's term, or an affective problematic. So how air pollution becomes a problematic of affect. A condition that might be articulated as a condition that co-constitutes entities and milieus. And we want to consider how a feeling, so a kind of affective feeling for air pollution, generates individuals, collectives, and responses to these ongoing events. So in the context in this seminar series on rhythm, we're kind of keen to locate this as an inquiry into what might be a movable border. So thinking about the movable borders that might demarcate citizen sensing and how we might intervene and move those borders. So these practices might be differently delineated as individual or collective. They're not only relational engagements across individuals, but are also relational articulations. And those are entities, relations in the way in which entities operate. In other words, these encounters with the perceptive and affective problems co-create the entities and environments that experience these conditions. So this is a way of addressing a kind of topology of political subjects, as well as a topology of the political milieu and the process of the trans-individuating individuals and collectives. So as these entities and milieus formed and are informed through practices of participation, we want to consider how participation is always a more than individual project, something that constitutes new collectives, as well as it might be a kind of rhythm in the sense of being generative, and it might be situated, but it also might be that these entities and milieus are past and in formation, so they're not pre-constituted objects coming into relation. Instead, processes of feelings and problems constitute these individual collectives and their way of relating. And I think there's some terrain that crosses into the previous presentation there. So along with this focus on how individuals and collectives are trans-individuated, in this work we've also been taking up this question of citizen sensing, and how that might not just be primarily a project of making knowledge, but is also a project of doing politics, and that's quite an important commitment for us. And Isabel Stengers has drawn the attention to the ways in which science is constitutive of facts and collectives, and how this process is always generative of politics. So in other words, for Stengers, science is both the production of things of interest, but also community affairs. Okay, so that importance in how science produces community affairs, and the way in which they assemble in relation to things. So as Stengers observed, productions and affairs are very laborious processes. They don't come easily. And it's not that easy to make a new science exist. In fact, or to kind of bring a community together to recognise a type of new scientific pursuit. So to use Stengers' term, and that's what I'm going to kind of unpack in this talk, is that it takes work to undertake scientific practices, whether they're citizen science or citizen sensing or other types of scientific practice. And that's a very different kind of approach to perhaps the Silicon Valley version of citizen sensing or DIY sensing, in which there might be this very smooth path to solving the problem of air quality. And as we were talking about this yesterday, that one of the early projects, the Air Quality Egg, that attempted to bring communities together to monitor air quality, they actually have a slogan on their box which says, you know, to plug in this device and solve all of your air quality problems, as if it would be that easy to assemble a kind of political collective. Okay, so we could, of course, apply this term of work to describe lots of our endeavours, that many endeavours in participation take a lot of work. Yet in the context of air quality monitoring, we want to think about Stengers' notion of work to imply that it might also be something that is intensive and transformative. So despite these marketing campaigns for these ever-expanding arrays of citizen, maybe click back to this image here, citizen sensing devices, the work of citizen sensing involves much more than developing new technologies, and instead points to the ways in which new practices, subjects, milieus and politics are worked through as perceptive and effective commitments to making sense of and evidencing the problem of air pollution. So really citizen sensing and the work that it involves is much more than developing kind of more and more e-waste to measure environments. Instead, the work of citizen sensing might be as a form of citizen science in itself might be able to further transform Stengers' notion of work as a science by moving the experimental facts in collectives where scientific work is undertaken out of the lab, so that we might think about how citizen sensing moves the work of science from the lab out into other places, other kind of configurations and constellations of citizens. And so this is not to kind of set up a kind of false or strict dichotomy between experts and citizens, because that is also a kind of movable border, but instead to think about how citizen sensors, and in particular the way in which citizen science typically work outside of these spaces and practices in which scientific knowledge is validated. So how the kind of work of validating knowledge also is kind of moving. So the field in which these scientific facts are tested out and able to take hold and do so in new ways of being together are realised are even more open to the pluralities and conflicts that Stengers has identified to be part of the way in which the politics of science play out. So kind of by moving out of the lab, these practices become kind of more exposed to perhaps some of the difficulties and the pluralities, but that might also be kind of intensive and transformative. So with citizen science, these contestations over authority, the legitimacy of actors, the intensity of scientific controversies, and the work undertaken to establish facts through these type of experimental apparatus also run up against what we might think about as the politics of evidence, in which communities of interest, some are listened to and some are ignored. And you know, I think that's been a kind of a theme that has really started to sediment throughout this morning. It's very present in Joe's presentation. So approaching citizen sensing as a techno-scientific practice, we need to think about it as something that configures entities, milieus and relations. And we want to extend Stengers' articulation of work as the labour that's involved in taking risks, problematising practices and destabilising alignments in a way that affect collective life through these citizen-based attempts to generate evidence. So there is a kind of labour in what citizen scientists and citizen sensors are doing. There's a labour in taking these risks, in the work in which they're trying to realign scientific practices. And this work also extends to ask how citizen sensing can intervene within environmental politics to reinvent collective capacities for making claims about environmental problems, such as air pollution. So how might citizen sensing intervene? How might it actually kind of reconfigure what the problems are and what the questions might be? So I'm going to talk about, in particular, take up these problems in a discussion of our practice-based participatory research of citizen sensing on air pollution. And in particular, to think about the pollution sensing work that we undertook in the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania. And as I was mentioning yesterday, this is a very intensely industrial area now. There's around, there's a huge number of wells being put up every day still. It's an area where there's fracking is taking place. It's a huge industry of natural gas infrastructure. And in 2013 we began a project there where we worked with citizens who were concerned about the pollution that might be coming from fracking, from natural gas infrastructure. And in particular they were concerned perhaps about the air quality effects, or the effect on air quality that fracking might be having. And at the time this was not something that the environmental agencies were wanting to engage with. But that's not to say that fracking itself is a kind of a black or white subject in these areas. These communities have been greatly affected by the influx of fracking, but it's a very complex scene in which whole families might be involved in working in the industry, and there's been kind of huge fragmentation across neighbourhoods and huge conflicts around this industry and its perceived effects. And of course this is also happening in an industry which traditionally had had a decline in income. So it was an industry that was bringing a new source of income. So it's kind of a complex scene. And so in this work we collaborated with around 40 residents, and there were quite differing political views across those groups. Some of them who were actually landowners who had fracking infrastructure on their land, and others who were very kind of anti-fracking. And we worked with them to develop a citizen sensing kit to think about what might be the types of pollutants they wanted to monitor, what their concerns were, how we might kind of approach an air quality sensing project in that area. So for those of you that don't know much about fracking, here's a diagram of a well being drilled. This was made by one of our participant collaborators. And you can see in this image there's a huge kind of hole drilled down into the shale where the gas will be extracted from. It involves trucks and trucks and trucks, sometimes up to 400 truckloads of water, which will be taken from the local water table, and that's then poured into the well. There's also a large number of chemicals that go down to loosen up the gas, and there's, as you can see there, a kind of outcut of silica, which is also piped down to open up and open the fractures when they take place. So it's a very invasive fossil fuel extraction. And the infrastructure really spreads quite widely over the landscape. So it's not just kind of confined to these wells, but there's also things like compressor stations, pipelines, wastewater storage, etc. So the communities that we were working with, they were actually already undertaking a lot of monitoring and sensing. They had been working with scientists, they'd been doing things like collecting water samples, they had been trying to commission scientists to do air quality testing. They had worked with the bucket brigade to take bucket samples. So there was a kind of fragmented approach and a kind of desperation to monitor, to try to kind of generate evidence, which is what the local authorities had asked them to do if they wanted to kind of evidence what they felt they were experiencing from this infrastructure. And so we worked with the group and we together kind of developed what might be a useful sensing kit for them to sense the pollutants from the fracking infrastructure. And in particular, what became apparent as a kind of pollutant of interest was particulate matter, which we borrowed a set of devices from Carnegie Mellon to sense the particulate matter. And particulate matter is a kind of well-known pollutant that has quite evident effects on health. And there were also some other monitoring kits that we used, so a badge which monitors the gases like formaldehyde and glutaraldehyde. We also developed this frac box. And really at that time, it was very much kind of working with a collaborative effort really across all of us to try and even find out what we should be monitoring, because actually that in itself was quite a hidden aspect, because many of the chemicals that are used in fracking are still proprietary, so there isn't any publicly available information on what's being used. And so in this research, we wanted to think about how the collectives might shift and form, and how they might transform through this process of working with this problematic of air pollution. And so part of the shifting of collectives involved kind of challenging the usual practices for who might be authorised to monitor and account for air pollution. So if we think about in the work of citizen sensing, might put into question the idea of what testimony is and for whom, while also redistributing those questions of who might be able to ask whose is that testimony and for whom. So such redistribution involves shifting the actors who can undertake monitoring and who might be able to gain authority about air pollution. And at the time when this project was happening, even though many citizens were undertaking sort of different types of citizen sensing, they really had a sense that their efforts to monitor were not being taken seriously by the authorities, and especially the data that they were producing. So the process of renegotiating and redefining expertise from air pollution is just one aspect of how an apparently amateur form of science, such as citizen sensing, of using some of these DIY kits, becomes political by challenging established accounts. So the participants collected a really huge amount of data over around 9 months, and they collected around something like 500 million data points. So they really did collect a lot of data on the air quality. So as Stengers notes, science in itself implies a kind of truth in the way that it conserves its traditional power to create unity beyond divergent interests. So that's the kind of idea of science. But part of the work of science is the effort that it takes to arrive at stable agreement of a problem, a situation or thing. So citizen science and citizen sensing, however, really kind of mobilise a very different alignment in the process of how something might become stabilised or destabilised. So the kind of approach of citizen sensing presents a very different approach to how pollution might be stabilised as a problem, in a way that potentially can upset the usual politics of expertise and evidence, not least by changing who gets to do that monitoring, who gets to read that data. And one of the things that has come up a lot during our meetings was that a lot of the previous projects that scientists had come in and done to monitor pollution, the data had never been returned or never been seen. So there was a lot of discussion at the beginning of who would own this data that was generated and who would have access to be able to draw decisions from it. So citizen sensing at the same time is something that takes a lot of time. If you imagine these citizens working for 9 months to collect all this data. And actually at our kind of opening event at our walk, we had a big discussion on the labour of citizen science and citizen sensing, and a discussion of whether it should even be undertaken, when it is perhaps something that a government should be doing, perhaps to monitor our environment. But in the kind of absence of that, if when we start to undertake this labour, it is something that takes time, and we include ourselves in this description. So it's a laborious process for all that are involved. So although we participated in the researchers visiting academics who were not resident in the community, we became really involved in the practices of working through this problem of air pollution in a way that didn't allow us to stand apart as a kind of disinterested observer. We were very much within the process. And so some of the work that I'm going to talk about engages with and addresses this tension that arises around expertise in relation to air quality monitoring. Not because they're somehow unusual or surprising, but rather that because it was the specific process of working through the struggles over expertise in which the particular collectors came into formation. And so one thing that continuously came up in our meetings was that we would be repositioned again and again as the expert. And this is something that we continuously try to resist, even though as women, as kind of queer women, it often placed us actually in quite a vulnerable position. And often other participants might suggest a male scientist that could come in instead and lead the project. But this kind of commitment to kind of being not the expert actually is something very important in how the collective began to kind of emerge into formation. So the work of citizen sensing and community engagement is not always straightforward, and it can at times create feelings of frustration, exhaustion and anxiety, and the expertise aspect was definitely one of those touch points that kept reoccurring, and I think will in the future as well. And so to engage with these feelings in relation to technology and participation, we might mobilise Simondon's writing on the collective potential of perception, which provides a useful approach for thinking about perception and its effects in relation to community engagement. So for Simondon, perception and effect emerge through our relations and our modes of collective individuation, wherein individuals feel that they are more than one when they're encountering perceptual problems. So, what this kind of points to is that the process of working out these type of problems, such as the problem of expertise, or such as the problem of two neighbours who haven't spoken for 5 years, coming into an air quality monitoring together and having to sit together for an afternoon, or us being accused of perhaps not building technology that was accurate or quick enough at some points. These problems, they also generate relations across individuals, collectives and milieus, which in themselves are emerging throughout this process. So the ways of working through these problems are shared, and they're also world-making processes. As Simondon wrote, the collective for an individual being is the mixed and stable home in which emotions are the perceptual points of view. And these points of view are also the possible emotions. So working through these problems, including the problem of air pollution itself, and even water sense, or the problems that were being emitted from the fracking infrastructure, requires the constitution of collective affect. Such constitutions of collective affect is also a process in which subjects are formed across environments. And these dynamics become a kind of feeling which kind of goes across the collective group. So this is not to say that these collective endeavours are a type of linear achievement in any way, or a smooth linear achievement at that, for solving kind of effective problems like air quality. But instead, they're a kind of basis for our ongoing encounters and negotiations. Or in other words, these kind of collective effective encounters are the very basis for how we might form political life. Okay, so I'm going to go on to talk about a particular event that happened during our monitoring period, which is perhaps an example of one of these kind of moments of frustration, exhaustion, anxiety, urgency, desperation perhaps. So within a week of collecting their spec PM 2.5 monitors, many participants had begun to run their own collective experiments and evaluations of the technology. So although on one hand we were very much encouraging people to take this technology and to run their own experiments, people really did kind of go with that. Participants started to borrow devices from each other so that they could run comparative tests. And this was partly not because they were trying to create a scientific experiment, but actually because they were sceptical about whether or not the monitors that we had given them were accurate or not. So they were kind of testing this kit, and they were testing us. And the scepticism of these devices was a particularly powerful, perceptive and effective problematic, because it really emerged in the ways that structured an evaluation process for the projects, with the participants monitoring each other's claims about what the devices were capable of. So, participants would be looking at each other's data, they would be, monitoring whether someone might be overclaiming or underclaiming, whether they'd positioned it in the right position, whether their device was functioning properly, whether we had in fact, provided a good enough device, whether we knew enough about the device, that often came up as well. And at the time we were also learning about the devices at that point, and still are. So in a sense, the community began to build their own monitoring standards through this kind of testing and this perceptive problematic. And at one point, one of the participants, Audrey, she started to describe how previously science had been done to us, but this time we were doing the science, we were making the decisions. So in a sense, the community began to build their own kind of understanding of what it might mean to do citizen sensing. So despite these kind of initial frustrations within this participatory approach to research, such as the questions around expertise, around who was allowed to be part of this collective group, the residents began to develop very concrete ideas about how the air quality data collected during the monitoring might be used. And in particular, some of the participants wanted to use this data to really stop the further expansion of fracking itself. And some of the participants wanted to use the data instead to engage in a dialogue with the industry, so to be able to have conversations. And others wanted to use the data to request improvements. So they wanted to use it to say, oh, we need more mitigating effects, or we need better equipment. So during the monitoring period, the residents began taking their collected data to town hall meetings, preparing reports and using the data for meetings and teleconferences with public health and environmental officials. And as I was saying yesterday, we at the beginning were very cautious, and we perhaps suggested people wanted to wait with the data, have time to look at it. But participants decided they wanted action, they were going to start organising these things. So in one particular county commission meeting, Audrey, who had previously talked about that she was doing science herself now, had brought her PM 2.5 data for discussion. as form of evidence to argue that the local government should, and their funds, so they were having a kind of funding bid, should be invested in undertaking air quality monitoring. Because actually in this whole area there was no air quality monitoring. So it really stops before the industry areas begin. So everyone was really quite in the dark about the air quality. And in the course of presenting the citizen sensing research that she was involved with and showing the data that she had gathered, she became embroiled in a debate, and quite an aggressive debate, with the county commissioner about the validity of the study. On the one hand, Audrey argued that the well-respected universities and academics were leading the research project as a way to try to demonstrate the perceived necessary forms of expertise that were in place to ensure the robustness of the study. Yet on the other hand, she also attempted to make a case for the validity of her own knowledge and data collection, as well as the experience in bringing forward this proposal to the Commission. So, you know, actually arguing that, yes, there were universities involved, but it was actually her expertise that had allowed her to understand this data and bring it for debate. So the heated exchanges that unfolded as Audrey presented her material were very much part of this process of working through ways of taking account of citizen monitoring. They also extended to the ways in which citizens might be able to have a voice in community forums and to make proposals for how public funds should be invested. Other residents in attendance at the Commission meeting began to voice their concerns over air quality in relation to fracking. So the kind of public opinion began to be mobilised. And they discussed in this meeting the extent to which their own health or the health of their families, particularly children who might be at risk of developing things like lifelong asthma, and how that might matter in relation to how the relevance of the community observations should be registered. This was in effect a collective working through this perceptive problem of air pollution. And this process of collective working and these kind of intense feelings also gave rise to the demand to take citizen environmental monitoring seriously. And so that's how the meeting progressed. And to allow for that monitoring to inform how residents lived and how they might exercise political agency in relation to their environments. And so I'll give another short example as well in which these kind of collective, effective problems emerged. So in another teleconference with environmental regulators and the public health agencies, Rebecca, who is the chairperson of Breathe Easy, who was one of the groups who had formed in relation to concerns about air quality, and Merrill, who was another participant, had talked through their findings of this particulate matter data. They presented the regulators with their evidence and their analysis of what they saw as a kind of reoccurring spike in the data. And this spike suggested that the pollution events should be looked at more closely. They also requested a follow-up monitoring by the state and federal regulators to be undertaken. And in the course of this conversation, there was a real kind of turning point in a way. And there were also kind of other exchanges that were happening in the background. But during this turning point, the regulators tried to suggest that the spec, the device that they were using, with which they had gathered the data, was not measuring at a regulatory standard. So that was one way in which they tried to undermine the data. And that the citizens had not followed the set protocols for taking the air samples. So a deliberate bias could be introduced by the citizens to their monitoring, that the monitoring should only be done indoors, as outdoor monitoring introduced too many weather-related uncertainties. So there was a real kind of effort to discredit this data. However, in their multiple encounters with regulators, residents found themselves refining their arguments and finding new ways to present this data, and generally developing a kind of resilience in the process of developing their environmental monitoring practices that were often dismissed. They also began to articulate how their data was not the same as the regulators' data. So they started to articulate, okay, well, it is different, there are differences in this, but that equally, it was equally important and that there were valid insights for this citizen-gathered data because of its spatially dense community monitoring network, and their protocols for data gathering were not entirely predefined, but instead developed through practice and through collective practice, as well as their strategies for addressing how to interpret and communicate the data. Because some of the communications were also happening in different constellations in different ways, so there wasn't a kind of overarching smooth PR plan for this data. Rather than return to their study, as suggested by the agencies, of measuring indoor air, which they wouldn't have been able to use to argue that there was pollution coming from fracking, they instead attended how they could instead address the air outside their homes, continuing to focus their concern on air as an atmospheric commons rather than a kind of individual home space, something that might affect everyone in the community. And in effect, this engagement with this perceptive and effective problematic was a process that articulated their collective and their relations. And so I'm going to conclude. Yeah. So through the process of undertaking this participatory research in relation to citizen sensing, air pollution and fracking, it became clear that these problematics of air pollution also generate a new form of collective potential for addressing these problems of air pollution. And in particular, the kind of topologies that we'll work through, from the mobilisation of data and evidence to the possibilities of transforming air pollution into a set of environmental practices, unfolded as relational engagements that articulated particular ways of developing feelings. Feelings for environments and feelings for collective political projects and feelings for collective political action. So these are not borders as necessarily kind of delineated spatial arrangements, but rather traversals made across experience, practices and political entities that rework collective sensation, political subjects and their potentials. So the citizen sensing research that participants undertook was not singular, but it was developed alongside other monitoring studies in which they were engaged at the time. And during the project, these relations were also shifting and mutating, together with the feelings and attachments to the scene. New community formations emerged through the new monitoring practices, stabilising and underscoring the importance of the ongoing existing monitoring practices. So the new relationships to researchers emerged, as well as new articulations for researchers of how they wanted to undertake participatory research. So this is a situation where there's a lot of researchers working with people, and what we saw was that this collective started to actually redefine what they wanted from doing research, and that being a participatory process. And they became very involved in the kind of work from which science and politics jointly emerge. So as part of this sensing practice, as researchers also became obligated to explore the possibilities of collective action that emerge with these technologies, and to really take seriously the commitments of the participants using the technologies. So citizen sensing as a practice for perceiving or documenting air pollution is very similar to scientific practice, but dependent, and in the same way as scientific practice, dependent on collective infrastructures of expertise, validation and feeling. So, you know, when the citizens were accused of bias, you know, they were able to kind of express that actually, you know, of course there is a kind of effective relation that scientists might have to their work. So in a way, unlike science though, these infrastructures are yet to be stabilised. And they're very much in this kind of ongoing process of being made and remade, contested and confirmed. So always in process. And the claims of what might be open, what might be participatory technologies do not automatically grant citizen sensing projects the power to mobilise action in relation to pollution or to realise the new form of collective potential. So beyond this kind of hyperbole of global media marketing, social networking and the kind of TED-style promotion of citizen sensing is in many situations not yet fully established as a legitimate practice for making evidential claims, and I think that's something that is important to keep on paying attention to. So, as the preceding account of our participatory pollution research has shown, the promises of citizen sensing as instantly democratic often obscure the work and that kind of effective work that it takes to move across and to make interventions into the sedimented practices. And these are practices that are contingent on the social, material and economic environmental conditions. Their community monitoring practices and forming collectives is not a matter of redistributing who can monitor in any simple way, such as just giving devices to citizens, but rather involves the effective grappling and collective encounters with problems that are brought about by existing practices in the attempt to forge new political capacities. The work of responding to environmental problems and creating political capacities is not easy, but it is a crucial part of our potential for collective politics and also for the emergence of community bonds. So I'm going to finish there.
Some urgent questions.
Did you notice other forms of political consciousness arising, not necessarily in the realm of environmentalism?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely, I would say, probably attention to things around who got to participate and who got to participate in civic processes, which I guess is a type of political consciousness. There was also attention to how the kind of politics of science itself, the kind of big science, which was always really present and began to emerge. But one thing, there were a lot of women who participated in the project, and I did observe a lot that they would talk a lot about how they had been excluded from being a scientist. So they might have had an ambition to go to university and be a scientist, and that just wasn't possible. So that also felt a kind of, the politics of being able to do science outside of an academy was something that rose. And actually a lot of people, they turn their attentions to kind of big politics campaigning at the end of this project, because it was just before and after the election of that person.
Yeah, there was a part where you said that I think these women, or that one woman that you were referring to, was saying science was done at us, and
to her,
we were to us rather than with us. You say nowadays these trends of also the fake news and the fake, not necessarily fake, but where people are against vaccination, and then you have all of these discussions where the one group says, well, this is completely crap, what they're saying, that's not true, where in fact it might be something to it, and the whole problem might occur because science has that elevated position where there are the specialists and they tell you what is good for you, that is a setup that people are not willing to really accept as much anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, in that particular context of vaccinations, I don't know, it's complicated, because I think in this project there was also, I think in a way there was a kind of affection for big science, because I think that was seen as the kind of ultimate way to validate the evidence that they wanted. So I don't think it was such a mistrust, but I think that there was perhaps the same thing might kind of apply to industry. So when industry had first come into the area, they had kind of pre-sold fracking as a very clean extraction process that was very profitable, and they had really kind of been the only ones who knew about it. It was very new and shiny, and they sent very good-looking people to sell it to everybody. And actually that was something that had turned, and they weren't willing to accept industry's answers. So I think that's definitely one. And actually in the longer article we talk about their description of we shit on peer review, because they had often heard industry people say that to them about university science, that they didn't rate it. So I guess kind of ties into the fake news.
I have a question to all speakers of today. In this written research, we took very serious this notion of coming to one, meaning that it's inspired by tabla as a musical instrument, which has a huge spectrum of rhythms. But what tabla player is saying that you can play any rhythms, but what is important to come to one rhythm at some point, to start from it, or to at some point to come to it, but be at the same time be very diverse. In Tumblr, it can be silence, for instance, so it's seen as a place of meeting. So you all encounter very different contexts and problematics, and really, I think you guys are addressing something that is impossible to answer. It's in a way impossible to find a solution, and in a short term, in like tomorrow, it's in a way impossible to synchronize or tune the opposition of it immediately, because there's always arguments against and pro. But what would you, if you would think about this one and what it could be? Would you think about something like that? Does it make sense, the question? What can be this in the metaphor of a Tumblr player, right? If there is a space where everything comes to one beat, to the silence, what could it be? And the place of meeting differences and pluralities.
I guess in the project, the citizens often talked about air as being something that everyone was breathing, and that it was kind of unavoidable. It didn't matter if you were a kind of huge supporter of fracking, you'd still be breathing that air. But maybe, I don't know, one way we start to think about it was almost like, I don't know if this is a one, but a kind of sets of constellations that were coming into contact in often in quite difficult ways and kind of tense ways. So that there was a kind of set of constellations that were kind of, perhaps forming this bigger collective. So perhaps within the one, there's also always this kind of processes of frictioning.
Yeah. And Joseph, in your case, how would you think about it?
I'm not entirely certain. I think there's a sense in which I've been thinking a lot about entanglement-based reason, and it almost feels like the movement towards, if the one is not necessarily homogeneity, perhaps the one is already there, but it's just not recognized. And
Okay.
I feel that almost sounds like some hippie 60s stuff, but sometimes you need hippie 60s stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And Tao, what would you say on that?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much related to what Joseph just said. It's like I think it's time to kind of like I don't know, but I would think about it as like what defines the one. I mean, how do we think the one in the sense of like and the idea of tuning. What does it mean? Like the conditions. Like I mean, with your presentation, I was very fascinated with the, for example, how like bringing the agent of like some kind of a device and building a community around it, like with the goal to monitor something, like creates a different territory altogether, like a different social territory, a different kind of relation of powers between the official science and unofficial science and the political agents. And that changes the idea of one. Who are we? How do we live? How do we self-organize? What does it mean to be in synchronicity? So I think it is. I mean, for me, it is I would say also the one is already there, but like how do we define it? And because the definitions are many, and perhaps the problem now is that it is defined in such a way that it is excluding, it is exclusive, and perhaps like, and this is very difficult because the whole structure that our society at the moment is based on has to be kind of put under question.
Yeah.
To redefine this one.
Thank you. Other questions? No? Okay, so I think this is a moment to say again thank you for three of you to come today, for you guys to joining us, and hope it was an inspirational, thought-provoking Saturday for you. Yeah, thank you so much, and see you next time, I hope.